Now we're going to continue with some introductions and then also some instructions. My name is Charles Mifsud. I'm a member of the Federal Association USA and a Knight in Obedience of the Sub-Priory of Our Lady of Lourdes. I served for 8 years as the Hospitaller for the Columbus, Ohio region. I'm finishing up my 6th and last year as a member of the Board of Directors of the Federal Association. I'm an attorney from Columbus, Ohio, and the chair pro tem of the newly created History Committee of the Federal Association. So let me give you a few instructions first, and then we'll continue with some introductions. First and foremost, please refrain from talking and keep yourself on mute for the entirety of the talk. This Zoom call is being recorded and will be made available for viewing sometime in the near future. The talk itself will last about 45 to 50 minutes, after which we'll have a 30-minute question and answer session. While the talk is ongoing, please write any questions you have in the chat box, and then after the talk, I'll ask the professor to answer your questions. Again, if I can make sure everyone is muted and stays muted for the entirety of the presentation. And again, please write any questions you have in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. Now, I know we have a large group of wonderful people on the Zoom call, including several dignitaries. And I'd love to introduce all of you, but I'm afraid it would take up all our time today. So I'll just say welcome to everyone. I saw that Michael Grace had registered, and I think he's online with us. Michael's a member of the Sovereign Council, so it's an honor to have him with us, and it's all the rest of you today with us as well. The person who I'd like to introduce first, I'm looking through the list to make sure he's on, but I'd like to introduce Professor Henry Wayne Hull. Henry, are you with us here today? Okay. Well, Henry is the chair of our new history committee, which is going to be putting on most of these talks for the next year, as well as some other activities we're going to be doing. He is the association historian and has been since 1992. And when Henry logs on, I'll ask him to say a few words, maybe at the end. But I want to make sure that everyone knows that we formed this history committee. 2024 is the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Federal Association, and we're going to be putting out some more of these talks and then some other materials for you so that we can learn about our history, both as an association and then as the Order of Malta. It's important that we learn about our history. History is an important part of evangelization. It's how we teach people about what we are and what we do. The church has 2,000 years of history to exemplify why we are who we are, and the order itself has almost 1,000 years of history. And again, the Federal Association has 50 years, but we've done quite a bit in that time, and it's time that we taught people about that history. This talk came about from some ongoing conversations I've had with people in the Federal Association over the years in regards to the history, especially Dr. Kara Agajanian, who's the chair of our formation committee. We had a good talk after our most recent formation, the day of formation, Washington, D.C. in March, and then we decided to move forward with something like this. And I'm really happy that we've gotten to the point where we're actually doing it now. So I want to thank her and Dr. Hull. But now, without wasting any more time, it's my most distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's program. Dr. Helen J. Nicholson has recently retired from her post as full professor of medieval history at Cardiff University after 30 years of teaching in UK academia. She's published widely on military religious orders, the Crusades, women's roles in both of these, and various related subjects. Her publications include, in addition to the Templars trial proceedings in Britain and Ireland from 2011, a history of Queen Sybil of Jerusalem from 2022, and most recently a study of women's involvement in the Crusades, which came out earlier this year. Most on point, though, not surprisingly, she's the editor with Anthony Luttrell of an Ashgate collection of scholarly articles entitled Hospitaller Women in the Middle Ages from 2006. So she has literally written the book on the subject. Personally, I've been a fan of hers for many years. I've devoured her writings, and we're incredibly honored to have such a world-renowned expert speak with us today. So I give you Professor Helen Nicholson.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And my first question is, can everybody hear me? Charles, am I coming through loud and clear? Good, thank you. The next thing I'm going to do now is attempt to share my screen. Right, has that worked? You should be able to see my screen now.
Perfect.
Right, so the women on the poster, Charles tells me, are starting on your left, St. Obadesca of Pisa. Number 2 is Donna Sancha of Aragon, Queen of Aragon, who founded the monastery of Sajena, of which more later. Picture number 3 is by Liberale da Verona, an Italian artist, and is Toscana, of whom again more later. And number 4 is another image of Ubadesca. I'm going to be talking about these subjects today: the beginnings of the Hospital of St. John, the regulations, women as full members of the order, associate women, hospital care, employees and tenants, and saints. Now, most people, when you mention Hospitallers, if they've heard of the Hospitallers and are not, like yourselves, associated with the order, will think of warriors fighting the Muslims. And on the left here, we have one of the beautiful images from Guillaume Caossin's manuscript record from his eyewitness experiences of the Hospitallers defending Rhodes against the Ottomans in 1480. And the Hospitallers are wearing their red tabards with white crosses. On the right-hand side of the picture, we have Hospitallers in peace, because they also, of course, ran a hospital and had many other peacetime roles. Here they are with their black mantles and the white cross. This is an early 14th century image. Jerusalem is where it all began. As most of you know, the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem began in the city of Jerusalem around 30 years before the First Crusade. It was founded by merchants from the Italian city of Amalfi as a hospice for poor pilgrims to the Holy City coming to Christ's sepulchre. And this, of course, is a sepulchre. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders were so impressed by the hospital's care for poor sick pilgrims that they gave it generous donations of land, income, tax exemptions, and legal rights, not only in the new lands they had conquered in the Middle East, but also at home in Western Europe. By the 1130s, the Hospitallers were involved in military operations in the Holy Land, initially in the defense of Christian pilgrims traveling the roads, and then more widely defending the land. However, in their hospital in Jerusalem, they continued to care for the poor sick who came to their doors, be they Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, both men and women. And they also employed women to look after babies and orphan children who came into their care. Now, the earliest regulations of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, attributed to Master Raymond Dupuy, don't mention women as members of the order. They refer only to fratres, or brothers. And here we have the French rule of Raymond Dupuy and the Latin translation on the other side. This is from de la Villarue's famous Cartulaire. The fratres of the order were instructed to guard their modesty when in women's proximity, and women should not wash brothers' heads or feet or make their beds. But while the regulations set out an ideal standard, in practice, the Hospitallers had to adapt themselves to local needs and the demands of their patrons. So as we look at the charters and estate records produced quite soon after Raymond Dupuy's rule, we found that in fact the Hospital of St. John admitted women from the start of the order, and women were widespread. And I'll be showing this map again, so let's see it now. This was originally produced by Mira Baum, but additions by Tony Luttrell, Carl Burkhardt, Hans Moll, and myself, and it is still an ongoing map, so it is not complete, but you will see there are many houses where women either lived or there were female as main members of the house or individual women living in the house. And the majority of the ones on this map are hospitaller houses with the upward pointing triangle. There are a few there which are Teutonic Order women's houses or Templar women's house. There's only the one. Some of the houses would have been just for women, as I said, but they would have had to allow men in because the male priest had to come in to perform priestly duties such as hearing confession or celebrating mass. Women's houses were sometimes attached to a separate house of men, or they might form part of a double house containing both men and women. Women were also associated with predominantly male commanderies. An anchoress could live in a cell within or just outside a male house, or even inside the male house. In the 1220s, some women were living in the Hospitallers' men's house at Hampton, near west of London, where Hampton Court Palace is now. In 1338, the Hospitaller male commandery of Beaulieu in the Priory of Saint-Gilles in southern France was supporting 2 sisters. They weren't given names in the record. And women also worked as servants in male commanderies. Many women involved with the Hospitallers had not taken the 3 religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were associate members. They might only have taken the general vow of obedience to the master, but they were still nevertheless closely related to the house of the Hospitallers, and they would have had some sort of active role in its life, even if it's only donating money. So what did these women do? Well, some filmmakers have imagined them involved in warfare. And these images are from a 1963 film by the Egyptian film director Youssef Chahine about Saladin, which is based on primary sources from the period, but he imagined the Hospitaller sisters fighting, which they did not. So here we have Louise de Lusignan, a knight of the Hospitallers. Here we is as a nurse. She is a nurse in the hospital of Acre. And here we have Louise and her Christian Arab friend Isa fleeing through the streets of Acre, pursued by the entirely fictional fanatical Princess Virginia of Carac and a Hospitaller and a Templar who are not wearing proper Hospitaller and Templar habits. So that's all fiction. In reality, Hospitaller women look like this, the bottom of the picture, where the Hospitaller sisters of Florence are receiving their constitutions from Brother Leonardo de Buonafede, who was lieutenant in the hospital Priory of Pisa in around 1400. And you'll see they're wearing same habit as the brothers, black mantle and a white cross. So here's our map of Hospitaller sisters again. Perhaps because of the warning in the rule of Raymond Dupuy that the brothers of the hospital should keep guard over themselves in the presence of women, women were soon given their own houses in the order, rather than having to share the men's houses. So, for example, in 1177, King Alfonso II of Aragon gave the Castle Risen to the Hospitallers in Aragon, and I've got them on the map there, how well that shows. Here we are, and they are. And in 1180, a Hospitaller house for women was set up near Prague at Maniten. In around 1185, King Henry II of England set up a religious house for 8 Hospitaller sisters at Buckland in Somerset, southwest England. Up until this time, they'd been living in different orders of men, but the king said this was not desirable. They should have their own house. Now, this is Buckland. It was a double house with a house of brothers, the priory and a commandery. The nuns' church is in the middle of the map there. The house itself has gone. There is a farm on the spot now, which I've got a picture of that at the top. It was a very dull, miserable day when we were there, so it's a rather dull picture, I'm afraid. So the sisters, there may have been 10 of them. There may have been rather more than that. The manuscript isn't very clear. A neighbouring house of Hospitaller brothers took care of their spiritual guidance, similar to the later arrangement at Florence, where the sisters were under spiritual oversight from the Hospitaller Prior of Pisa. However, at Sahaina, where in 1187-8 Queen Sancha founded House of Sisters, the sisters' house was superior to the brothers' house. The priests lived outside the enclosed cloister separately from the women. So they were out number 20 and 19 here. And Sahaina had its own rule. However, most the other women's houses didn't follow the same rule as Sahena. The rules varied according to local circumstances and the founder's wishes. But clearly, the Hospitallers could not refuse powerful donors such as Queen Sancha. If they declined to accept these women's houses, they would have lost these patrons' valuable patronage, their influence, as well as their money. Houses like Sahena were self-governing, where the sisters were largely independent of men, and in theory they were supposed to stay inside the cloister, like nuns. However, they could travel about on the order's business, and Bewley, for example, this is St. Fleur of Bewley, that's her house there. Bewley is quite a common name for houses, of course, because it just means beautiful place. St. Fleur was based here in Bewley, but here within 10 kilometres, many miracles related to her took place, and her life explains how she was travelling around within this area, not restricted to the house, and then there were other miracles associated with her further afield, which she may not have actually been present herself. But clearly she was not restricted to one house. The Spanish and French hospitaller houses for sisters became so prestigious that there was sometimes a waiting list for admission. And new houses were founded throughout the Middle Ages. They also continued into what we call the early modern period. St. Fleur's house continued through the late 18th century, when the French Revolution took out all the religious houses in France. The house at Florence continued until 1808. A house of sisters was founded in 1490 at Seville in southern Castile, and houses of sisters in Portugal were reformed in the 16th century, so they still continued that late. In 1582 or 3, different scholars say different things about the date, prompted by the Catholic Reform movement, the Hospitallers set up a women's house on Malta, dedicated to St. Ursula. Now, St. Ursula was most famous for her maritime activities, sailing across the sea from Britain to Rome and then back to Cologne. So she's an appropriate saint for the Hospitallers, who by this time were very much associated with maritime operations. However, the Hospitallers had a relic of one of St. Ursula's maidens, but not of St. Ursula herself. The house of St. Ursula still exists on Malta, and there's a picture of it there at the bottom. It had its own regulations, and it received papal approval quickly. It operated separately from the main order, but associated with it. That slide has shifted itself. Female donors to the Order of St. John. Some of the leading donations came from the noble women and royalty of the Iberian Peninsula, where women controlled their own property. In the 1120s, Queen Urraca of Castile endowed the Hospitallers with a town on the border with Portugal, and her great niece, Urraca of Portugal, to her right in that picture, married Ferdinand II of Leon. Their marriage was annulled in the early 1170s because they were too closely related. They were second cousins. Urraca retired to her estates, but she donated land to the Hospitallers and took vows at one of their houses later on. And as I just mentioned, in 1187 to 88, Queen Sancha of Aragon founded the house at Sahena for Hospitaller sisters and some brothers. And I've got some pictures of this one. The chapter house was magnificently decorated. Regrettably, the house was very badly damaged during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, but some of the remnants of the ceiling are in the Museum of Art in Barcelona. This is the magnificent doorway into the church, and the church was a royal mausoleum. Queen Sancha and her son Peter II were buried there, as were other members of the royal family. And these are the sort of beautiful tombs that they had. This is Sister Isabella of Aragon, who died in 1434. The foundation demonstrated the commitment of the ruling family of Aragon to holy war against the Muslims in Spain and their interest in Jerusalem. A very visible sign of this dedication to crusading. But donations didn't always work out as planned. At Aikenbury in Herefordshire, which was founded by a local noblewoman, Margaret de Breos. It was founded in memory of her father, her mother, and her elder brother, whose deaths had been caused by King John of England, although John, on his deathbed, gave permission for her to found this house, and it would pray for his soul as well as for the souls of Margaret's family. She entrusted it to the Hospitallers, but in 1237, after a long legal battle, she convinced the Pope to allow her to transfer the nunnery from the Hospitallers to the Augustinians. It appears that the Hospitallers wouldn't let her choose the prioress, which as patron she claimed the right to do. They wanted to take income from the house to support their work in the Holy Land, and she wanted to keep it all within the house. They claimed the right to move the sisters to other houses, which Margaret wouldn't allow. Her house, her sisters. And there was also hints in the letters that she sent to the Pope that the Hospitaller chaplain had not been behaving properly towards the sisters. But by this time, relations had completely broken down. So whether this was the case or not, I can't say. Women also made donations of money and land to the order because it gave charitable support to captives and former captives, and the Hospitallers negotiated ransoms for those captured by the other side. The women also contributed to crusade indulgences, which were issued to raise money for crusade-relating projects, which didn't need extra personnel, but did need money. So you could take a vow of crusade, and then instead of going, you would give money, and you would receive the same indulgence of your sins as if you had gone. The Hospitallers issued, first of all, written indulgences and then printed indulgences. And this is the printed indulgence to help finance their operations in the East, notably their defence of roads after the Turkish siege of 1480, when they were rebuilding roads. This is one of the printed indulgences from there, and you'll notice the gaps in the text where you fill in the name and the date. Before the end of March 1480, one Simon Montfort and his wife Emma had brought a printed indulgence for this purpose, and in April 1481, John and Catherine Frisden bought indulgences at Oxford in England to help relieve the Hospitallers after their successful defence of Rhodes in the previous year. So you too could have a part of the Rhodes defence. Moving back, I was going to say, going back to that slide, you'll see the reason we have these printed slides is they're printed by William Caxton. So they're kept in England, like associated women. Right. Many women were involved in the Hospitallers without taking the 3 monastic vows and becoming full members. There were different types of association and different words were used to describe them. But and so it's not always clear when someone's called a consoror whether she is an associate sister or a full sister. So I'm just going to use the word associate as a blanket term here. The military religious orders all organised support groups known as the confrari, the friary in Britain, or the confraternity, whose members were exempted for a seventh of their penance in return for an annual donation, and at their death they would receive church burial in one of the Hospitallers' churches, provided they were not personally excommunicated. So it's a kind of post-mortem care you were paying for, post-mortem life insurance. Post-mortem insurance? Members didn't join a house, but they made an annual payment and they could give other gifts as well. And they would have been included in the daily prayers for all the order's benefactors, male and female, alive and dead. So women as well as men joined the confraternity, sometimes with their husbands and families, sometimes as individuals. Now, some women became donats, which means they had given themselves to the order. They hadn't taken all 3 vows, but they'd taken a vow of obedience and they'd undertaken to join the order in the future, possibly when they became a space at the nearest house, or because they didn't want to join yet, they had things to do, but when they were, for example, widowed, they would join. They might make a donation of property now, or they might retain their property for their lifetimes and give it to the order after their death, or when they join the order. Some donats lived within one of the Hospitallers' houses and wore a form of the habit, but some didn't. The Hospitallers didn't have a period of probation for new members, a novitiate like other religious orders have. So becoming a donat could be a form of probation. And some female donats were young women who intended to enter in future as a full sister, as I say, when a place became available. Others were widows. who wanted to associate themselves with a religious house in the last years of their life and have a place where they could live. Some donats were married women who became donats with their husbands or with their husband's permission. For example, in 1338, at the house of Echelle in Provence, so this is not on my map here, but we're down here again now, one Beatrix Ponsetta was a donatrix. She was the only woman there, donatrix meaning female donat. There was also a Peter Poncet, a non-nobleman, possibly her husband, son, or the father. Possibly she joined with him because they've got the same surname. They don't tell us that, though. They merely mention they're both there. There were two women donati at the hospitaller house at La Pointe-Laval in Provence in the same year, so we're still down in the same area. They were called Argentina and Agnes, and not given any family name. They were living in a house that had 20 brothers and 20 male donats. They got their food and their clothing, but we are told their names this time, but they're not called sisters. So presumably they're not fully professed. There's also a Beatrice, who was a donata at Commandery of Roux in the same year. She was living with 15 hospitaller brothers and 9 noble male donats. And Nadina, who was a donata at the Commandery of Avignon, which again isn't on my map because she's the only woman there. She was living alongside the 12 brothers and 8 male donats. Did she have her own accommodation? I'm afraid the record doesn't tell us. The order also had male and female corodians. Now, these people had made a donation to the order and in return received a corody, or a regular allowance of food, clothing, and sometimes cash in a religious house. And sometimes they had a servant paid for as well. Sometimes the order would grant corody as an act of charity. In the 14th century, the hospitallers at Kilmoynham in Dublin, which is up here, but not on my map because it doesn't have any sisters, granted a daily gift of bread, beer, and a meal to Alice Tararev and her daughter Mathilda for the sake of charity and considering divine love. The grant didn't state that Alice was living in the house, but the corody would have provided her and her daughter with support at their time of need. We don't actually know what the need is, but it's implied by the wording of the donation. The 1338 survey of the hospital's properties in England shows that women were also among the 80 or so recipients of annual cash pensions from the order's treasury. These could have been corodies paid in return for donation or payments to former employees of the order who were now too old to work, but the record doesn't tell us. So we have Margarita Florentine, who'd been granted a pension of 6 marks a year. Our mark is 2/3 of a pound. Doesn't help you much, I'm afraid. At the time, then, Brother Leonard de Tubertis was Prior of England, so that would have been in the early 1330s. John of Oxenford and his daughter Joanna received 30 marks a year. Alicia Conmartin, John's wife, and Rosa, the daughter of John and Alicia, also received 30 marks a year. Walter Neal and his wife Alicia received 30 marks a year. This is obviously the standard donation. And Marjorie of Betoyne received 7.5 marks a year. That's only a quarter of that, what they got. Then there were 3 other Betoynes, male, John, Edmund and Benedict, who presumably related to her, but we're not told how, who were each getting 5 marks. So she got more than they did. Margaret de Batchworth was receiving 6 marks a year. John of Chartney and his wife Margaretta got 9, and Agnes Tyas was receiving 52 shillings, which is £2 12 shillings. So women did receive some quite impressive handouts. However, if most scholars naturally take it for granted that the women in hospitaller houses must have been caring for the sick, because in other hospitals not related to the hospitallers, that was what the women were normally doing. They were employed, or they were sisters within a hospice to look after sick people. It's clear that the hospital did involve women in caring for the sick, but they weren't normally professed sisters. I've got pictures of 2 of the hospitals here. One on your left is a plan of the hospital in Jerusalem. This has now been updated by recent excavation, but this is the copy of the plan I've got, so it's the old plan. And on the right, we have a picture from the hospital's 13th century headquarters at Acre, where they had got a hospital, but this is actually their main hall. Pilgrims who visited Jerusalem in the 1160s and 1170s recorded the hospitals that John cared for both men and women in separate wards, and there were women called sorores domus, sisters of the house. who were responsible for the oversight of babies who were entrusted to the house and presumably cared for these babies' mothers and sick women pilgrims. The Hospital of St. John also employed wet nurses to look after these babies, but the hospital's regulations didn't say anything about these women. After the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, which in fact did not involve any hospital sisters fighting, or at least no contemporaries mentioned it, the Hospitallers moved their headquarters until in 1191 to Acre, when the Third Crusade recaptured it from Saladin. There were presumably Hospitaller sisters living in their house at Acre because by 1219 there was a new house at Acre specifically for Hospitaller sisters. The primary sources don't say they looked after the sick, however. There is a 14th century epic poem about Reynaud de Montauban, who is a Frankish hero, and much more could be said about him. But he, for reasons we won't go into now, he ends up doing penance in the Holy Land. And in the story, he goes to the religious sisters at a hospice for the poor or hospital in Acre. And however, it's not clear that this is the hospital as we know it, particularly as it's set long before the hospital was actually founded. But the hospital's own myths at this time said that they'd been founded before the time of Christ, so it may be intended to be our hospital. In any case, unfortunately, the sisters did not look after him. This is all part of his penance. So that is not actually favourable towards our hospitallers. Moving closer to home, Toscana, whose picture you saw at the beginning, who was a married woman from near Verona, helped to care for the sick in the hospital of Verona and later became a donat there, but she wasn't actually a fully professed sister, though she was associated with the order. It appears generally the hospitallers employed women to care for the sick, and hospitaller sisters themselves weren't expected to take the role on. For example, in a charter of 1361, there was a mistress or manager of the Hospital of the Sick at Würzburg, and I have got that on my map. Here we are. There. Alongside a master of the Commandery Hospital, and a further charter of 1364 mentioned a deceased mistress of the hospital there named Luca. But neither charter says she was a soror, a fully professed sister, so she might have been employed for her expertise in managing the hospitals. The accounts of the hospitalers' commandery at Manosque, which was down in southern France, or this area down here, for the fourth Sunday of August 1288, record that 3 shillings were paid to a certain woman for serving the infirm of the house, while the accounts from October 1289 record that 18 pence, that's 1 shilling and 6pence, were paid to a certain woman who had served a certain sick donat of the house. So these hospitaller brothers were employing a woman to care for their sick rather than bringing in a hospitaller sister for that task. In 1338, the hospital commandery at Montélimar, again in Provence, was employing a maid to serve in the hospital of the poor, which cared for the poor and sick. And at Châtillon-en-Dioz, a maid was employed to serve in the hospice or hospice to cook, wash cloths, make bread, and do the other things necessary. In the early 15th century, a Hungarian slave woman named Helena was working in the hospitaller's infirmary on Rhodes. But none of these were sisters. Moving on, let's have some tenants and employees. These women are not actually working for the hospital, but they're doing the sort of things women did. They're milking the sheep. Because the hospitalers were landowners, they couldn't avoid interacting with women. The women might be their tenants or their employees. The hospitalers had regulations, as I said, against, for example, employing women to wash their hair. Nothing about not letting women do the milking or the cooking or the laundry or helping with the harvest. So the weekly accounts from Manosque show women being paid to gather produce such as chickpeas, grapes, nuts and olives, wash wool, clean and mash beans, hoe around the growing crops, carry wine, carry water to the wine press, put the wine in barrels and store it, carry raisins for preserving, collect hay, sew up pillows and make white candles. The 1338 survey of the hospitalers' houses in the Priory of St. Gilles show hospitalers employing women in similar tasks. And the brothers who brought in specialised female labour in form of The brothers also brought in specialised female labour in the form of laundresses. In 1338, 10 hospitaller men's houses in England were employing laundresses, and 2 hospitaller houses in the Priory of Saint-Gilles. Doing the laundry was very much a female gendered job. If you could employ a woman to do it, you would. Women were also employed within the hospitallers' houses. Again, the survey of hospitallers' houses in the Priory of Saint-Gilles in 1338 recorded the brothers employed a maid at the house of Meules Beaulieu-sur-Orange. There were no sisters or female donats at the house. It had 4 brothers and a male donat, so presumably she was the housemaid. She looked after the house. Likewise, in 1338, hospitallers were employing a maid at Châteauneuf-de-Mézac, which was part of the commandery of Le Poët-Laval. It had no resident brothers, but it had a maid to look after the house. And at the commandery of Manas, there were 7 brothers, 2 male donats, and a female maid. And the commandery of Montélimar, there were 7 brothers and 6 male donats, and a female maid. In fact, there were 3 maids, one of whom worked at the Hospital of the Poor. The hospitaller's house at Nice in the Priory of Saint-Gilles in 1338 had a laundress cook, the all-male house. She was provided with her food and clothing and described as living in the said house. The 1373 papal survey of hospitaller houses in the Priory of France recorded many houses employed 1 or more maids, or waiting women, or chambermaids, as well as male house servants. Sometimes the records specifically refer to accommodation for women within the house. So an inventory drawn up for the hospitaller house of Bajol in Roussillon in 1376 mentioned a chamber where the lady sleeps. The lady wasn't mentioned elsewhere as a sister or a donat, so presumably she was an employee. The hospitallers also held slaves and bondspeople. These were people bound to the order's land or personally donated to the order. Slaves could have been captured in battle or purchased. The hospitallers' manumissions of slaves on Rhodes and Cyprus in the 15th century suggest that women represented around a quarter of the slave force on these islands, not counting the men used at sea as galley slaves, and had been bought by the order, for example, to work in the infirmary, or by individual brothers rather than being captured. The hospitallers of Rhodes legislated on the sale of male and female slaves, so they had both. On Malta, the hospitallers gave male and female slaves and captives as gifts to eminent Latin Christian figures to gain or ensure their friendship and support for the order. Take an example from my book on women and the Crusades. In 1557, the hospitallers Grand Prior of France captured 2 young Turkish women and their brother who were en route to Mecca on pilgrimage. He presented the young women to Queen Catherine de' Medici of France and her sister-in-law, Margaret of Valois, who was soon to be Duchess of Savoy. Their new owners baptized the elder, whose name was Fatih, as Catherine, and the younger as Margaret. And the 2 new converts were married to Frenchmen. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, their mother petitioned Sultan Suleiman to get them released, stating they'd been forced to convert to Christianity, and she enlisted the Sultan's daughter and granddaughter in her support. The Sultan accordingly refused to release any French prisoners until the 2 Turkish girls were freed, but the French refused to send them back to Turkey on the basis they were now Christians and happily married in France. The younger woman, Margaret, had become Lady of the Bedchamber to Catherine de' Medici. So the captors would not give up these high-profile Christian converts, royal protégés whose conversion bolstered French royal prestige. And despite all the agitation of the mother, the evidence is that they never went home. As I mentioned, captures in battle, warfare is our next subject. Although they regarded women's involvement in crusading as undesirable, because as non-combatants, women would consume resources that were needed by the fighters, and their presence would undermine the moral fibre of the army because the men would try to protect the women, medieval canon lawyers didn't oppose women's involvement in warfare. But they just assumed that women would normally redeem their crusade vows by payment rather than by going on crusade in person. However, women could validly join a crusade if they could afford to raise and lead a military force themselves. There's no evidence that hospitaller sisters fought in physical battles, but it clears that sometimes the order's female tenants, employees, and other associates did. Women commonly paid played a labouring role in war, and that's what this picture is about. This again is from Guillaume Caossan's account of the Hospitallers' defence of Rhodes against the Ottoman Turks. And the women are wearing head coverings, as they're all decent, married, respectable women, carrying stones and earth to help reinforce the battlements. And you'll see they're carrying some very heavy loads. There's wood there. This is not easy work. Yes, the Grand Master of the Order, the high officials, the knights, citizens, merchants, married women, newly married women, and maidens all work to strengthen the walls and ditches, carrying stone, soil, and lime, he says. Again, during the defence of Malta in May 1565, Francesco Balbi de Correggio described soldiers, women, and children and beasts of burden bringing earth into the fortified town of Bergu in preparation for assault by the forces of Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. So women do take part in battle, but on the sidelines, building up the defences and supporting the soldiers. There's also a second-hand account, inevitably second-hand, of a Greek woman who was reported to have died as a martyr fighting at Rhodes against the Turks during the siege of 1522, which the Hospitallers lost, of course. Reportedly, according to the story, she was the mistress of a Hospitaller officer who'd been killed during the siege. The report says, not wishing to survive him, she kissed and blessed their two little boys, killed them with a knife so the enemy couldn't capture them, threw their bodies on the fire so that the most vile enemy could not possess the twin nobility of their bodies alive or dead. Then she donned the dead officer's clothes, still soaked in his blood, took his sabre and rushed on the Turks. She died fighting strongly in the manner of men, says the report, as a Christian martyr. So such stories proclaimed the power of even weak Christian women over their Muslim enemies and demonstrated their dedication to Christian martyrdom. Whether the story is true, I cannot tell you. However, as we're speaking of martyrs, let's have some saints. So even the Hospitallers' first rule, which told the brothers to avoid women, has one female figure as a leader and inspiration of the brothers, the Blessed Virgin Mary. Accounts of the Ottoman Turks' siege of Hospitaller Rhodes in 1480 carried on this theme with the story that the Turks received a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist, their other patron, coming to the Hospitallers' assistance. And this is the image in which this is depicted. The Turks have broken in through the wall. The Hospitallers are trying to drive them back. And at the moment of crucial crisis, in the sky, we have this vision of Mary and John, both dressed in white, with white shields with red crosses on them to show that they're holy warriors. And the Turks who saw this, reports Guillaume, were struck with horror and fell back. Now, this played down the brothers' achievement, ascribing their triumph partly to the aid of their saintly patrons. But this story also reinforced the order's image as a holy order, which fought God's wars, for the Virgin would not have helped them if they had not been just and holy. The Hospitallers also venerated other female saints, such as Catherine of Alexandria, Ursula and the 11,000 Virgins, and St. Euphemia of Chalcedon, whose relic they got from the Templars. Scholars have generally assumed that in religious orders where all men were celibate, devotion to female saints gave the brothers an outlet for their natural sexual drive. The Hospitallers may also have particularly encouraged veneration of female saints because their virtues of chastity, patience, long-suffering, modesty, and humility, particularly the long-suffering under torture from the enemy, benefited the brothers' community and discipline and helped to transform them into an effective, unified force of dedicated religious men who would not give up in the face of adversity. Because it's these perseverance virtues which were needed in the battle against the Muslims. Initially, the Hospitallers didn't promote the sanctity of their own members, people like St. Flora Bolia, for example, beyond local devotions. But in the 16th century, after the Council of Trent, the Central Convent on Malta began to develop the cults of their holy brothers and sisters. In 1622, Giacomo Bosio, an official historian of the Order of St. John, published a short book of devotional images and lives of the Order's saints, including some female saints. So here they are: St. Orbodesca of Pisa on the left, St. Toscana in the middle here, and St. Fleur of Bolia on the right, who'd previously been venerated only in their own localities. So I'll sum up. So as with other religious orders, the majority of the Hospitallers were men. Their regulations warned the Hospitallers that associating with women could have an adverse effect on their spiritual vocation. However, this was a warning to the brothers they must take care of their own spiritual lives, rather than a condemnation of all women. The order welcomed donations from women and accepted individual pious women into their ranks. They employed women on their lands and even within their houses. Arguably, women could contribute most in those regions of Europe where local law and custom allowed them to have control of their own property, such as Spain and Portugal. But even in England, for example, women joined the Hospitallers as sisters. Outside the order, women supported the brothers, taking part in the confraternity and purchasing indulgences. The Hospitallers valued women's prayer and their economic contribution and promoted the cult of female saints. Women's contribution was significant to the order's achievements. And here I have a quotation from Brothers of the Teutonic Order, promoting one of their female saints. They said, the women were fellow soldiers with the brothers in their spiritual battles. I shall finish there. For further information, the book that Charles has already showed you, and Mira Bomb's book on women and the military orders of the Crusades. Thank you for listening.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Nicholson. That was really a wonderful and enlightening talk. I very much appreciate you taking the time to deliver this lecture. I know everyone else does as well. And now I hope we can impose on you for a little bit more time so we can answer some of the questions that the attendees have for you. Is that all right?
Yes, I hope they're answerable.
They're actually, they look like they're great questions. So let me pull these up real quick and okay. I'm sorry, I'm looking for my chat button here. So the first question, I had it and I lost it. Chat. I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties with the chat again. Okay, one of the questions that came very interesting, Colin Alberts asked, did any of the women who could raise a military force as the price of joining a crusade exercise command and control of them in battle? You're muted. Hang on.
Right, sorry, muted myself so I wouldn't interfere with you. The best example I know of this is Countess Alice of Blois, who took our military force to the Holy Land in the 1280s, shortly before the fall of Acre, to the Mamluks. And in that case, she and her husband had originally intended to travel together, but he had died. And she initiated the building of a tower and a church and saw what her forces were doing. But whether they actually went out and engaged the Muslims, I don't know, because at that point there was a truce. So we were talking about making defenses rather than going out and fighting on the battlefield. It wouldn't be normal for a woman to lead her forces on the battlefield, except in occasions of emergency, and there are few of these have been written about, but not so much in the context of the Crusades. Very famously, one of the countesses of Brittany actually led her forces onto the battlefield when her husband was in prison, and everybody else's reaction was to run away. As far as the Crusades go, however, it would have been a great shame if the women had to lead their forces on the battlefield. And their role is usually understated because yes, we're in the land of gender stereotypes here. So you can have a wise woman like Queen Melisende of Jerusalem in the 1140s who gives good advice. But then if anything controversial is being done, as when Queen Sybil was defending Jerusalem, and they very controversially surrendered it to Saladin after Balin of Ibelin negotiated a peace treaty, Balin of Ibelin gets all the credit stroke blame for that, and Sybil isn't mentioned. And this may be because it was not a very, it was extremely controversial. It was criticised very much by people who were there at the time and involved. We would have fought to the death, they said. We didn't want to surrender. as well as in the East, in the West. So you don't bring the Queen's name in. It would dishonor her. It was a bad piece altogether, but she was pushed into it. She had no choice, say the sources. On that basis, it's very difficult to know, therefore, whether women do exercise command. Jean de Joinville mentions the Queen of France, Margaret of Provence, taking command in the city of Damietta. She's in childbed at the time when her husband, Louis IX, had been captured by the Muslims during his first crusade to Egypt. And here she calls the people to her, the Italian merchants, the other merchants who are in Damietta, and says, will you stay and help defend the city? And they say, no, we're off. And she said, well, we'll all starve because we rely on you to ensure food coming into the city. Sorry, can't be helped. I will buy all the food off you, she said, so the city will have enough to eat, which she therefore did. And they were able to carry on the defense. And then she, rather her representatives, have to negotiate a truce with, in fact, it's the Sultana of Egypt at that point, and Louis is released. So in that case, yes, she's taking command. But it is very difficult. You have to go through the sources very carefully to find out whether it's the woman who is taking command and giving the advice, or whether it's all being ascribed to one of her male ministers. Because, yes, we wouldn't like to have to say she had to be involved in this.
Right.
It's dishonorable for a woman to have to be involved in public.
Yeah. So if they were, they wouldn't necessarily admit it to the history books.
Yes, the only way you would know, perhaps, is if the Muslims told us, because it shows how badly the Christians treat their women. I mean, everybody knows that women should not be forced to go out in public. These terrible Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And Saladin is always depicted as being very protective towards women. So that's all part of being a great sultan, is to defend noble women and look after them.
By shutting them away.
Moving on to the next question.
There's another question. Michael Corpus has a great question. Is there evidence that St. Hildegard of Bingen and the Benedictine Second Order had any direct impact on the women hospitallers, or indirect impact on the working of the women hospitallers by way of her work in medicine? And this leads me to a little bit, I guess, maybe a question that I've had is there was the Benedictine convent of sisters in Jerusalem, and so I guess the wider question is, how did the women the Benedictine sisters have an impact on the hospitallers?
Well, of course, there were Benedictine sisters in Jerusalem, and so if there was any influence, the Benedictine sisters in Jerusalem would have had the same contact with Arab hospitals as the hospitallers themselves did. I'm not aware of any written evidence. Of course, as historians, we work from written evidence rather than from later oral tradition. I'm not aware of any written evidence that there is any influence. Historians found this very difficult to pin down, in fact. We know that in Western Europe, the Arab medical texts had become available in the West by the time that Hildegard of Bingen was writing, because after the King of Castile, Alfonso VI, I think, had captured Toledo, he'd got possession of the library. It was a Roman library, but it had been kept up by the Arab rulers of Spain. I can't call it Castile because it wasn't at that point. But yes, anyway, the Arab rulers had kept the library going. So it had Latin texts, Greek texts, and Arab texts. And a lot of these Arab medical texts have been translated from Greek or indeed from other languages. So this means that the Middle Eastern, Central Asian, Indian medical knowledge gets into Western Europe, and scholars all over Western Europe were traveling to Spain to learn Arabic and read these texts. And that is more likely to be the route whereby medical knowledge reached the Rhineland, because we certainly know of people who traveled from that part of Europe, from Germany to Spain, to study in the library at Toledo. And the texts circulated translated into Latin, some of them translated into French. I'm afraid I don't know if any of them translated to German. They probably were. Rather than them coming through the route from the sisters in the East. That is to say, however, if anyone travelled, they would bring back all the stories, no doubt. And it's also been pointed out that some of the necessary medical plants probably came back in the hands of merchants, and possibly carried by pilgrims as well to Western Europe. Humans love carrying plants about.
They do. So there's another question by one of my fellow Maltese people. Christine Muscat has a great question. In Malta in the 16th century, besides the nuns of St. Ursula, the Order of St. John also founded a Magdalene cloister. The Magdalene nuns in Malta were hospitaller nuns, but because of the regulations emerging from the Council of Trent, their administration was transferred to the bishop and remained closely associated with the Order of St. John up until their suppression in 1798. Do you have any knowledge of that, or anything you want to talk about with that?
I'm afraid I haven't got any information about that. Thank you for that information. You'll know that this talk was actually called In the Middle Ages. So I went on to St. Ursula at the end, but this is not my area of speciality. I thought we should have St. Ursula and Giacomo Bosio saints, because they're medieval saints. And the hospitals had their relic of St. Ursula's maiden since at least the early 1400s, but I don't have any information about the Magdalene cloister. Of course, the hospitals did have a relic of the Magdalene as well, which was lost, or rather the reliquary was lost during Napoleon's invasion of Malta. I'm very interested by that information, so thank you very much. I think Teresa Van, who has been working on studying the nuns of St. Ursula, will probably know about the Magdalene cloister, and she's been working in the archives on Malta for many years. So this is more her area of study. Thank you for that, and I'm sure everyone here will be interested to know about that.
Well, that might be another topic for another one of our Zoom calls. It might be hospitaller women from the Middle Ages on.
Yes, so carry on after it doesn't all end with the Protestant Reformation and the Council of Trent. It continues and grows.
So I'm just going to let everyone know, as we're coming to the end of this talk, this is your last chance to put questions in the chat box. I'm going to finish up with a couple more questions, but if you have any, please put them in there. And if we run out of time, I might impose upon our speaker to answer them by email, but please put any more questions you have in the chat box. There's a question by Lucinda Lancaster. Which documents do you find most useful for this topic, and how did you compile all these documents together?
Yes, well, I referred to some of them during the course of the talk. I didn't give you a list at the beginning, which I sometimes do when I'm talking to the students, but it becomes extremely wordy and technical. A talk I gave during the summer about the Templars, somebody complained I was trying to cram too much in, so I thought I would spare you that. It is very much a matter of needle in a haystack for most of this. The Hospitallers were on a number of occasions told by the Pope to do a complete survey of their estates. So I mentioned 1338 and 1373, and in the course of those, they mention who is in each house and who is employed. None of these records are actually complete. So for 1338, we only have the records from the English tongue, which only covers England, with a slight reference to Scotland. Oh, there's a war in Scotland. We don't know anything about Scotland. Ireland? Nothing about Ireland at all. And then we've got one from Provence, and the others all seem to have vanished. So presumably they were all sent into the Pope and then filed. And we all know what happens when governments file things. Sometimes they get found and sometimes they get lost. And in 1373, they were supposed to have done another survey, but that one doesn't seem to have covered England. And it hasn't all been published. I've worked through the one for the Priory of France and the Priory of Italy. Those have both been published. And I don't think the Priory of Italy actually mentioned any women at all. That doesn't actually mean that there were no women. It just means it didn't mention them. The Priory of France does mention the women who are employed and the women who are living in the houses. So that is what I said about that is a result of days of working through the printed version of this document. And I'm afraid on this one, I draw the line. I'm not going back to the manuscript. That's my colleagues. They can do that. There are other documents which survive in manuscript, which again, they can work through. So this is many years of collecting information. Some of them is information that Tony Luttrell had collected. I referred to the weekly accounts from Manosque. We just have them for a couple of years. And usually these weekly accounts were not kept, but that particular group was sent to Prague for some reason. And it was at least still there until very recently. So that we have, and again, you can work through and see who's being employed, who's being used to do various different jobs. And then sometimes the regulations mention women, as you heard. So it's a very wide range of material. And it's a matter of, yes, working through it over many years, looking out all the time for the women, because one of the problems with this subject is because scholars before the Second World War were convinced that there were no sisters in the Hospitallers. They never spotted them when they were there. And it's only when you start looking for them that they appear, which is quite astounding. I've been assured by very eminent military order scholars, not obviously Tony Luttrell or Alan Forey, but others, that there were no women. And then you start looking, and there they are. But you have to be looking out for them.
Another question, this is from Colin Alberts. He asks, in your recent book, Women in the Crusades, do you cover all of this as well as female auxiliaries to the Teutonic and Templar orders? And
no, I summarize it considerably.
Okay.
So I produced an article recently for a German journal called Ordines Militares. And even that's a summary. Tony Luttrell complained I'd left out some of his sisters. I said, yes, I'm very sorry, Tony, I ran out of word space. So the Women in the Crusades deals with it quite briefly at the end of one chapter. The article in Ordines Militares, which was published last year, has more information about it, as well as the Teutonic and Templar orders. And some of that material I just put straight into this talk because it's material I found quite recently. And then, of course, there's the books that I showed you, which has more information. And Mira Bond, for example, tries to categorize the different liturgies that the different orders were using. But as a matter of fact, of course, in some areas, they wouldn't necessarily be following the liturgy of the order. They will be following whatever liturgy the local diocese was using, because they didn't always have hospitaller chaplains. Though the hospitallers have more chaplains than some of the military orders, they don't necessarily have to have one chaplain for every house.
The liturgy of the order is a topic that I have great interest in. So that might be another topic for a Zoom call for us. I find that fascinating. So is that book the one you would recommend as a general book on this subject, or is there another book that you would recommend? Which book would you recommend as if someone were to read one book on women in the hospitallers, at least from the medieval times? Which book would you recommend?
Yes, right. Well, Hospitaller Women in the Middle Ages is quite dense. So if that's what you like, lots and lots and lots of very detailed material with all the references to make it even more detailed and dense. Some people like that best. Then that's your book. Mira Baum's book on women in the military orders of the Crusades is still a very scholarly book, but it's slightly less dense and slightly more readable. It's also quite a lot shorter, so you'll see there's less information in it, but it might give you a wider overview. I see there's a question in the chat whether Women in the Crusades covers the Crusades in the Baltic region. Yes, it does. But we have the problem that Alan Murray has pointed out, that the women did not actually get involved in the crusading armies in the Baltic. So I have some nice anecdotes from the Western writers about the Crusades, about women as captives, and also about Dorothea of Montagu and her involvement in the crusade. But they have less involvement than they do in other regions. Again, Alan speculated about this. Is it just because it's seen as being far too dangerous to let women go there? Because the Baltic region was very dangerous.
So the one thing I've taken away from this talk, which has been wonderful, is that there's just such a very rich diversity of roles that women have played in the order: tenants and employees, sisters, consorts, associates, donuts, part of the confraternity. So many different roles. What do you think? How should a modern Dame of Malta today view this history of women's roles in the order? What's the takeaway for a modern Dame of Malta from this body of information?
Well, going back to when I started studying this subject, there were sisters in the order. I've certainly been told to my face that there were no sisters in the Middle Ages. So yes, the dames have a history that goes back almost, in fact, when the hospitals were founded, there was a hospital, there was the male monastery, the hospice attached to it, which was the hospitallers, and there was also a women's house, which wasn't part of the hospitallers. But there were sisters there all along. They'd always cared for women. They employed women to look after babies and pregnant women. So it's not, the stories that you might have heard that there were no sisters are quite untrue. I'm not sure how they arose, but they are quite untrue. And also that just as the hospital was always open to anyone, anybody could be an associate, even if they hadn't, for whatever reason, couldn't be a full sister. Because if you had a family to look after, if you had a husband to look after, you had other work to do, like you were trying to govern a kingdom, you couldn't become a full sister, but you could still be an associate and support the order, give your time and your money. And so that is still the case. Whereas sometimes the contemplative orders might appear less open and friendly, it was more difficult to get in there to be a member or take part. The hospitallers were always open. Well, I'm afraid they were criticised by this. They take anybody. But I thought, well, surely that's a good thing. Everybody can serve God.
Yeah. So I'm struck by that as well, that you were told that there's no nuns. I remember in my studies reading the account from John of Wurzburg, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, 1165, and he said that, he gave a description of the hospital at the time that had 2,000 beds, stalls for 2,000 beds, and I don't think he gave. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't remember him giving a breakdown of what percent was what, but he said that there were beds for women and pregnant women, and so certainly. As we know, at that point in time, men were not allowed to care for those women, certainly not the pregnant women. And so that automatically would necessitate women having a role in our order from the very beginning. So I was struck by that early in my research. And so this question has always been one of course, there were women in the order in Jerusalem and on. So. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
I don't think there's anything I should add to this. Anyone who wishes to take up this banner and carry on research, there's a great deal of material in Malta which has never been looked at or has not been looked at since it was written. And every country in Europe has archives, except what was blown up in the last war, which give you more information about the hospitals, which again have not been looked at in full. Every so often, material will come onto the market from private owners, and some of it disappears into the hands of private owners again very quickly. Again, about the hospitallers. The whole subject is very much under-researched. So people look at the Templars because they think they're exotic, but the hospitallers did so much more. Whatever was going on, the hospitallers were there. So.
On that note, I want to give a plug out to the Malta Study Center, which is a part of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University. And Dr. Daniel Gullo and others are, I know right now in Italy and in Florence and Malta, digitizing all these old records and making them available at the Malta Study Center. And I know the University of Malta is very involved in sifting through all those documents, whether they're the originals at the archives or whether they're the digitized versions at the Malta Study Center. And I know that at least in the last few years that I've seen, the scholarly research in these subjects has just exploded. Again, especially at the University of Malta, and I think we're in for a pretty wild and enlightening ride here as far as scholarly works on this subject, and hopefully someone will take up the topic of women's roles.
Just in the chat, archives of the nuns of St. Ursula have been digitized by the Hill Monastic Library as well, which is great news.
Yeah. So I guess we'll end the program here. It was an amazing program. I want to thank everyone for coming. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, or if your question comes to mind later, just email the email address that you had, orderofmaltaoh@gmail.com, and I'll see if I can hand that question on. I want to thank again Professor Nicholson for giving this talk. Very, very much appreciate you giving us this time and imparting your knowledge on the subject. Your knowledge on the subject is vast, and I know you could talk for days and days. And really just amazing for us to have such a world-renowned expert speak to us today. Again, I want to thank Professor Henry Hall, the historian of the Federal Association, the staff at the Federal Association, especially Regina Tabanova, who set this call up, and not least of all the rest of you that attended today's presentation. If you enjoyed today's talk, just keep your eye out, be on the lookout for future invitations. Hopefully this is the first in a long series. And thank you for joining us. God bless you all and have a wonderful day. Thank you.